their behavior. They then begin to, interact with polite society in an acceptable way, and they not only, embrace ethics, but in some instances even embody ethics. And he talks about an example of a Jewish lawyer where the bar didn't even want to certify him, and then he became a judge in later years, and they held a banquet for him because he was so popular. And this is like the exception of the rule. It's like, okay, this, you got to remember, Mr. Ross here is a member of high society, and a lot of the Jews he's interacting with are going to be in high society. And so, yeah, okay, maybe you're going to know a couple of high society Jews that have successfully integrated with WASP society in order to mingle with you. But this is the exception, not the rule. And this idea that this is going to be something you're going to see throughout, well, we know now today that that's not the case.
For example, some years ago, the Bar Association of New York opposed the promotion of a certain Hebrew lawyer to the bench on the ground of his unprofessional practices. But this same lawyer made one of the best judges the city ever had, and when he retired, he was bagwitted by the association. The truth seems to be that the lower class of Jews of Eastern Europe reach here moral cripples, their souls warped and dwarfed by iron circumstance. The experience of Russian repression has made them haters of government and corrupters of the police.
See, again, this is the environment argument. He's saying that probably what accounts for all this bad behavior that we see with Jews like Abe Saffron, that we see with Jews like Meyer Lansky, that we see with these Jews like Jeffrey Epstein, that we see with these Jews that, pick one, like any powerful Jew, this universally bad behavior that here we are a century later, it's still happening. He imagines that the reason why it seems to be bad is they're coming from an oppressive environment. And it's kind of odd because he talks about how dishonest the Jews have been in their reporting when it comes to the immigration issue here domestically in America. But for some reason, he doesn't seem to put together or at least not, maybe he did in other writings, but not in this chapter. He never imagines that perhaps the reporting on the pogroms themselves were similarly altered in order to make the Jews look like the victims, these poor oppressed people that had to flee through no behavior of their own, there was no fault of their own. And so he says, it's probably something that this is the naivete I mentioned at the beginning of the stream. He imagines that this kind of behavior is something that will subside eventually, that this is all the product of oppression that they suffered in Russia, and that they will cease to have this Jewish behavior after living in America long enough.
Life amid a bigoted and hostile population has left them aloof and thick-skinned. A tribal spirit, intensified by social isolation, prompts them to rush to the rescue of the caught rascal of their own race. Pent within the Talmud and the Pale of Settlement, their interests have become few, and many of them have developed a monstrous and repulsive love of gain. When now they use their old world shove and wile and lie in a society like ours, as unprotected as a snail out of its shell, they rapidly push up into a position of prosperous parasitism, leaving scorn and curses in their wake.
See, again, weird that description. Weird how that description seems to be just as valid 100 years later.
Gradually, however, it dawns upon this twisted soul that here there is no need to be weasel or hedgehog. He finds himself in a new game, the rules of which are made by all the players. He himself is a part of the state that is weakened by his lawbreaking, a member of the profession that is degraded by his sharp practices. So, smirk and cringe and trick presently fall away from him.
See, this is what he imagined. He imagined, all right, they're shisty, they come in here, they break all these rules, but that's because they're from Russia. And eventually they're going to realize the damage they're doing to their own profession, the damage they're doing to their own nation, and they'll stop acting this way. Well, sorry. Hello? Is this Professor Ross? Yes, Edward Allsworth Ross. This is Devin Stack from the future. Yeah, you were totally wrong. Yeah, no, turns out, no, they're just like that. Yeah, still exactly like that. 100 years later, I know, it's crazy. Exactly like, yeah, no change in behavior whatsoever. What's that? No, they've got like a lot of influence. One could argue that they should feel way more invested. But, they're just as he described, they lie all the time. No, they're still, into prostitution, and they've commercialized, vice. Absolutely. Yeah. But have you heard of trans kids? There's like this other thing they're doing. Well, okay. Well, we'll talk later. All right. Sorry. I just had to call Edward from the future, and let him know how wrong he was.
And he stands erect. This is why, in the same profession at the same time, those most active in breaking down standards are Jews, and those most active in raising standards are Jews of an earlier coming or a later generation.
See, he's talking about, again, that, the older Jews that have been here longer, they're going to, sorry. And this might, what this might be? This could be because he's a progressive, and he might have agreed with some of the radicals that had established themselves. And you'll hear this today, right? You'll hear a lot of, like the Stefan Molyneux of the world talking about the great contributions of Ayn Rand. Something like that. So not realizing that, no, that's still Jewish. That's still Jewish. And she was a terrible person, by the way, like awful person.
On the average, says a Jewish leader, only the third generation feels perfectly at home in American society. This explains the frequent statement that the Jews are the limit, among the worst of the worst and among the best of the best.
Again, this is something here from people like Stefan Molyneux and others that are libertarians or that are libertarian-leaning MAGA types, they'll tell you that, the ones that will even admit that there is bad Jewish behavior, they'll try to counterweight that by saying, well, that's true, but there's also really great Jews. But then they'll list the great Jews, and it's people like Ayn Rand. It's people that are still they're radicals that are pushing fundamentally bad philosophies onto white people.
The Hebrew immigrants usually commit their crimes for gain, and among gainful crimes they lean to gambling, larceny, and the receiving of stolen goods, rather than to the more daring crimes of robbery and burglary. The fewness of the Hebrews in prison has been used to spread the impression that they are uncommonly law-abiding. The fact is, it is harder to catch and convict criminals of cunning than criminals of violence.
So that's the same as today. It's not that Jews are more law-abiding, that when they commit crime, it's usually white-collar crime. Jews are not the ones that are going to go break into a store during a riot or hold up a 7-Eleven or even rob a bank. Or if they do rob a bank, it's not going to be with a gun. They're going to do Ponzi schemes. They are going to commit fraud. They're going to exploit people with, there's endless financial crime strings that we've done when it comes to Jews, taking advantage of high trust Europeans and milking them for all that they're worth. And that's harder to catch than some black guy named Tyrone carjacking someone.
The chief of police of any large city will bear emphatic testimony as to the trouble Hebrew lawbreakers cause him. Most alarming is the great increase of criminality among Jewish young men and the growth of prostitution among Jewish girls. Says a Jewish ex-assistant attorney general of the United States in an address before the B'nai B'rith. Suddenly we find appearing in the life of the large cities the scarlet woman of Jewish birth. In the Women's Night Court of New York City and on gilded Broadway, the majority of streetwalkers bear Jewish names. This sudden break in Jewish morality was not natural. It was a product of cold, calculating, mercenary methods, devised and handled by men of Jewish birth.
Now, in this statement, he's talking specifically about people like Abe Saffron. Talking specifically about, because this is 1914, this is when you have all these mafia families, these Jewish mobsters coming to prominence, like Meyer Lansky, like Murder Incorporated. All of these mafia groups are gaining money and power through prostitution and through gambling rings and illegal clubs. And so that's what he's talking about, that a lot of Jewish organized crime is popping up among these younger, more, I guess, inventive, as people like to characterize them. These inventive Jews finding loopholes in the system and exploiting them and just monetizing vice.
Says the president of the Conference of American Rabbis, the Jewish world has been stirred from center to circumference by the recent disclosures of the part Jews have played in the pursuance of the white slave traffic. On May...
Again, white slavery, that hasn't changed at all. Jeffrey Epstein. So I don't know. The Jews are shocked at their participation in something that they've always participated in. They're always shocked. They're always shocked at their own behavior.
On May 14, 1911, a Yiddish paper in New York said editorially, "It is almost impossible to comprehend the indifference with which the large New York Jewish population hears and reads day after day about the thefts and murders that are perpetrated every day by Jewish gangs, real bands of robbers. And no one raises a voice of protest, and no demand is made for the protection of the reputation of the Jews of America and for the life and property of the Jewish citizens." A few years ago, when Commissioner Bingham came out with a statement about Jewish thieves, the Jews raised a cry of protest that reached the heavens. The main cry was that Bingham exaggerated and overestimated the number of Jewish criminals. But when we hear of the murders, holdups, and burglaries committed in the Jewish section by Jewish criminals, we must with heartache justify Mr. Bingham.
Now, we've talked about this specifically. That's the police commissioner of New York. Commissioner Bingham was one of the first targets of the ADL. Or I don't know if it was called the ADL at the time, but B'nai B'rith, what would later become the ADL officially. He was the police commissioner that began to notice that a lot of the organized crime that was taking place in New York was Jewish immigrants. And he wrote an article that describes in specificity the Jewish participation in organized crime in New York. And the ADL, or what would become the ADL, spun into action and attacked him politically and got him, or took him down. So he was canceled. He was one of the first people ever to be canceled by Jews, simply because he noticed that Jews were committing way more organized crime than other groups.
2 weeks later, the same paper said, "How much more will Jewish hearts bleed when the English press comes out with the descriptions of gambling houses packed with Jewish gamblers, of the blind cigar stores where Jewish thieves and murderers are reared, of the gangs that work systematically and fasten like vampires upon the peaceable Jewish population, and of all the other nests of theft, robbery, murder, and lawlessness that have multiplied in our midst." This startling growth reflects the moral crisis through which many immigrants are passing. Enveloped in the husks of medievalism, the religion of many a Jew perishes in the American environment. The immigrant who loses his religion is worse than the religionless American, because his early standards are dropped along with his faith. With his clear brain sharpened in the American school, the egoistic, conscienceless young Jew constitutes a menace.
So this is where he's talking about how, look, obviously, there's another thing to point out. Obviously, being Jewish is considered a race at this point, because he's talking about how the Jew loses its religion and he's still a Jew. That notwithstanding, though, the fact that he's pointing out that the Jews that lose their religion, the Jews that are just they immigrate here and they become secular, they're almost more dangerous. They're almost more dangerous because now they're completely they're completely rootless. They are now just running off instinct. And so when people say like, oh, you know, like, for example, you'll hear a lot of these MAGA types talk about how, oh, they're not Jews. Those are secular humanists with Jewish last names. Well, they're still Jews. And it's because this behavior is biological. But he is talking specifically about those types of Jews and how they're a menace.
As a Jewish labor leader said to me, the non-morality of the young Jewish businessmen is fearful. Socialism inspires an ethics in the heart of the Jewish working man, but there are many without either the old religion or the new. I am aghast at the consciencelessness of the Luft proletariat without feeling for place, community, or nationality.
Rootless, self-interested psychopaths like Abe Saffron. Abe Saffron and Meyer Lansky, etc., those weren't unique. They were uniquely successful, but their mindset was anything but unique.
If the Hebrews are a race, certainly one of their traits is intellectuality. In Boston, the milk station nurse gets far more result from her explanations to Jewish mothers than from her talks to Irish or Italian mothers. The Jewish parent, however grasping, rarely exploits his children, for he appreciates how schooling will add to their earning capacity. The young Jews have the foresight to avoid blind alley occupations. Between the years of 14 and 17, the Irish and Italian boys earn more than the Jewish lads. But after 18, the Jewish boys will be earning more, for they have selected occupations in which you can work up.
So here he talks about how the Jewish children will not be put into factories, as an example. A lot of the immigrant families, the Irish and Italian immigrant families, would have their kids, as soon as they were able, go either work in a factory or go work some, this is before there were child labor laws, obviously, go work some kind of menial, labor job somewhere to help support the family. And the Jewish families wouldn't do that. And that's because the Jewish families would focus more on education. And so that, okay, maybe from age 10 to 18, the Irish and Italian children are making more money. But once that Jewish kid is now educated and able to go get a job in a higher class profession, working as maybe a dental assistant or a lawyer's apprentice or something like that, by the time that they are adults, they'll far outpace their Irish and Italian counterparts, because Irish and Italian immigrants are focused just on the immediate. And really, I think this is something that white people need to come to terms with, that we talk a lot about time preference. We talk about how a lot of what separates, or I guess contrast, the behavior between white people and blacks, as an example, is that blacks don't seem to look ahead into the future and take into account the consequences of their actions, even a little bit into the future. In fact, there's African languages that don't have future tense. Like when you look at their original languages, how they're structured, they don't have concepts really that even involve the future. And that you could say that that's something that separates Africans from Europeans when we talk about the environments that we evolved in, because Europeans had to be cognizant of the winter that was going to come, where supplies and food would become scarce. And if you didn't plan ahead for this inevitable winter every year, you would die. Whereas in a more tropical environment in Africa, food and resources are kind of just all around all the time, and you don't have this cycle of always preparing for the future. And this is something that's been discussed for many years. But I think that we need to accept that this is something that Jews seem to be phenomenal at, in terms of looking at the future and playing the long game, far beyond at least the average of white Europeans, where a lot of this stuff that you see, this Jewish behavior, the investments that they make in the future and that pay off because of their investment, that far exceeds anything you see from white people, and certainly pro-white people that are have high in-group preference and care about our race. There doesn't seem to be the same level of investment in the future. And that's something that we need to address. That's something that could be addressed with eugenics, but it's something that we need to address. The fact that, certainly we have a better understanding of future behavior when it comes to, should I run away from this cop who just pulled me over for speeding, versus what a black person might think in their head, like, should I lash out emotionally in this moment without any kind of thought as to what kind of repercussions that could lead to. We should be thinking about the long game. We should be thinking more about how not just in our own, the window should not just be, as I think boomers have kind of really illustrated how often this manifests in white people, where boomers will look at the future, but the future ends when they die. There's literally nothing beyond that. There's no thought as to the inheritance that they should, as just part of their responsibility as parents. They should be building an inheritance that they'll never get to touch, that they'll never get to benefit from, they're specifically building wealth for future generations. They're planting a tree that they'll never be able to sit underneath. And this is something that I think has been lost in white people, perhaps because of this independent selection event that took place when many of the white people came to America, this rugged individualism that's just gone to a wild level now, because I don't think it's always been the case with white people, but it's certainly way more pronounced in white people, this inability to think about the future and to make plans that are going to pave the way for their people. I mean, that's certainly, you say what you want about Jews, their behavior is almost entirely focused on that as a group. I mean, Jews are always thinking about what is going to be good for Jews as a people in the long term. In fact, I mentioned at the beginning of the stream that a lot of people watched the stream that Nick Fuentes did talking about the Trotskyites and how they, morphed into what is now considered the neocons. And this is we're talking about a decades-long plan that is now bearing fruit with people like Donald Trump at the top of the hierarchy bombing Iran for the Jews. This is the kind of thing that I don't think white people do. They don't have this, it's not a natural inclination to collectivize and to make these long-term plans that for the benefit of the race. And that is something that is going to be a major obstacle when it comes to trying to compete with groups that have that software installed, for lack of a better term. Because Jews certainly have that software installed. It comes pre-installed. It's not something they have to download. I think it's something that white people are going to have to develop and download. And I think it's something that will, if they don't, it will either, I think it'll inevitably, it'll go one of two ways. It'll go the really bad way, where there is no white people, or it'll go the way where the white people who end up surviving, there'll be another selection event. The white people who do end up surviving and being prosperous, it's because they will think ahead. Now, I think that it's not that we don't have it. It's just that it's become outdated. It's become obsolete, the way that we think about things. Like, for example, you'll notice there's a lot of white preppers. That seems to be an exclusively white behavior. White people that like to store, and I do that. I've got like a year's supply of food in at least a year, where if, all hell broke loose, I could, the whole system collapsed, I could just live out here at least for a year, which would give me enough time to figure out what the fuck I need to do. And I think white people think ahead in terms of that, where it's more, again, it goes back to that rugged individualism where, can I survive on my own? Can I plan ahead for the possibility that the system will not be there, where I can live independent of the system? But it's a different kind of way. It's a different way of thinking that probably has occurred because of different conditions that we evolved in. We evolved in the idea that, that especially in America, if you're a founding stock American, that there might be a bad year where there's no good crops. There might be, some kind of natural disaster. There might be a war. There might be these, these things you have to prepare for. And those are totally different things than how do I, subvert the host country that my group is in to produce things that are good for my people, that's the environment that Jews have evolved in over the centuries, where they have been in host countries and their ability to survive, and they've survived as a diaspora people for centuries. And the only way that has occurred is because of this focus, this hyper in-group preference, coupled with this focus on how do we plan ahead long term so that we can continue to wield influence and power in the host countries that we're in. And that's just something that we have to compete with now. That's something we have to figure out a way of competing with, or we will be outcompeted. Like that we will lose. We will lose this battle if we can't start planning long term and for our people, for not just our children, but our children's children, their children, and so forth, and start to orient our lives towards what I've talked about before. I've described as be that guy, be that patriarch, be that person that starts the dynasty that will be your family. Don't sit there and indulge and spend money and time and resources on things that are frivolous. And instead, if you really care about white people, you really care about your family, focus more on being that guy, that patriarch, that head of the family, that when your descendants, they look back at that family tree of where their prosperity really started, you're that guy, you're that main character, you're the one that they name their children after because you were the one that started that dynasty. That's something that that's a mindset that I think white people are very capable of. I can't put my finger on exactly how it's been diluted and in some cases even eradicated from the minds of white Americans, but it's software that needs to be installed if we're ever going to make it.
The Jew is the easiest man to sell life insurance to, for he catches the idea sooner than any other immigrant. As philanthropist, he is the first to appreciate scientific charity. As voter, he is the first to repudiate the political leader and rise to a broad outlook. As exploited worker, he is the first to find his way to a theory of his hard lot, viz. Capitalism. As employer, he is quick to respond to the idea of welfare work. The Jewish patrons of the libraries welcome guidance in their reading, and they want always the best, in fiction, Dickens, Tolstoy, Zola, in philosophy, Darwin, Spencer, Haeckel. No other readers are so ready to tackle the heavyweights in economics and sociology. From many school principals comes the observation that their Jewish pupils are either very bright or distinctly dull. Among the Russo-Jewish children, many fall behind, but some distinguish themselves in their studies. The proportion of backward pupils is about the average for school children of non-English-speaking parentage. But the brilliant pupils indicate the presence in Hebrew immigration of a gifted element which scarcely shows itself in other streams of immigration. Teachers report that their Jewish pupils seem to have hungry minds. They grasp information as they do everything else, recognizing it as the requisite for success. Says a principal, their progress in studies is simply another manifestation of the acquisitiveness of the race. Another thinks their school successes are won more by intense application than by natural superiority, and judges his Irish pupils would do still better if only they would work as many hours.
Now, some of that's going to be opportunity, right? Some of that's going to be opportunity if your parents are making you work in a fucking factory to help support the family, you're not going to have the same opportunity. Some of it is aptitude, though, too. I know there's a lot of people that deny the claims of high Ashkenazi Jew IQ. I understand the arguments against perhaps the way it's described, but I can just tell you from personal experience in working with Ashkenazi Jews, there are a lot of things, but stupid is usually not one of them. And that is just the case. Your opponent is intelligent, and to underestimate them in this regard is going to lead you to failure. They are cunning and they are intelligent, and if they weren't, then what's your excuse? If they weren't, then how did they manage to do this? It's not just a lack or a contrast in morals. It is intelligence too. We are dealing with some smart people. Now, look, there's just as many, if not more, smart white people. In fact, there's obviously more white people if you just factor in our numbers, our sheer numbers. There's many more white geniuses. And there are stupid Jews. There's plenty of stupid Jews, and there's plenty of midwit Jews. But they are certainly not the stupidest immigrants that we've ever accepted in this country. And it's yet another argument why just because immigrants are high IQ doesn't mean they're going to be good for your society. This argument that that should be the prerequisite or really the only filter that we apply to immigration, and that is the direction that you're going to be, you're going to hear this sort of stuff, especially post-Trump, I think, from people like J.D. Vance. You're going to hear that we need to be letting in immigrants who are high IQ. I mean, this is what you hear from Elon Musk. This is what you hear from libertarians. You're going to hear about this meritocracy. You're going to hear about this colorblind meritocracy, people that should only be filtered out by aptitude, by IQ, and with no other consideration. And the problem with that is not the only thing. That's something we can measure. And unfortunately, I wish we had other ways of developing, or we could develop tests that would measure not just your mental acuity in terms of pattern recognition and the other things that IQ tests, but I wish that we could also test for ethics. You could test for I mean, I guess in a way you sort of can, but I wish that was something that we could filter for. If you could filter for people that had if you could filter for morality, then okay, you'd have a little more of an argument here. But the problem is, if you have high IQ people with incompatible morality, it's worse. It's worse. In the case of Abe Saffron, if Abe Saffron had been an idiot, then he never would have been successful. Meyer Lansky had been an idiot, there never would have been a problem. If Jeffrey Epstein had been an idiot, there wouldn't have been a problem. The part of the problem of Jews is that they're smart, and part of the problem with high IQ immigration, not just Jews, but other ethnic groups too, like Asians, etc. People will say, well, they're not physically violent. They're not robbing 7-Elevens, right? They're not carjacking people, and they're high IQ. Well, if that's all that mattered, then we should just live in Asia, right? If that's the only difference, because East Asians are going to score higher on average than whites on IQ tests, and they're not, they're underrepresented in violent crime. So we might as well, let's just open the floodgates to China. Just let every fucking Chinaman who wants to live here. But that's not the only difference. That's not the only thing that makes up the character of what we have known as what an American is for centuries. And that's, unfortunately, that's what we're going to lose our identity. Well, I feel like we've already done that. Ask anyone what an American is today, and it's not going to conjure up the same image that it conjured up in 1914. It's not going to be synonymous with white European anymore. It's not, unfortunately. So I think we've already lost that as an identity. But moving forward, if we wish to restore any of that, or maybe prevent that same thing from happening in places like Europe, then this is the sort of thing that we need to take into account, that IQ is not everything. You can't be an IQ supremacist, or you're going to live in Asia.
The Jewish gift for mathematics and chess is well known. They have great imagination, but it is the combinative imagination rather than the free poetic fancy of the Celt. They analyze out the factors of a process and mentally put them together in new ways. Their talent for anticipating the course of the market, making fresh combinations in business, diagnosing diseases and suggesting scientific hypotheses is not questioned. On the other hand, an eminent savant thinks the best Jewish minds are not strong in generalization and deems them clever, acute, and industrious, rather than able in the highest sense. On the whole, the Russo-Jewish immigration is richer in gray matter than any other recent stream, and it may be richer than any large inflow since the colonial era. Perhaps abstractness is another trait of the Jewish mind. To the Hebrew, things present themselves, not softened by an atmosphere of sentiment, but with the sharp outlines of that desert landscape in which his ancestors wandered. As farmer, he is slovenly and does not root in the soil like the German. As poet, he shows little feeling for nature. Unlike the German artisan who becomes fond of what he creates, the Jew does not love the concrete for its own sake. What he cares for is the value in it. Hence, he is rarely a good artisan. And perhaps the reason why he makes his craft a mere stepping stone to business is that he does not relish his work.
And this is one of those differences he's noticing. That it's, they're smart. They're very smart, but they're kind of sociopaths. They don't have this sentimental, romantic view of the world that a lot of white people have. And that's yet another thing that gets exploited. That's why Jewish propaganda has worked so well and continues to work, because they know exactly how to pull our heartstrings.
The Jew shines in literature, music, and acting, the arts of expression. But not often is he an artist in the manipulation of materials. In theology, law, and diplomacy, which involve the abstract, The Jewish mind has distinguished itself more than in technology or the study of nature. The Jew has little feeling for the particular. He cares little for pets. He loves man rather than men, and from Isaiah to Karl Marx, he holds the record in projects of social amelioration. The Jew loves without romance and fights without hatred. He is loyal to his purposes rather than to prisons. He finds general principles for whatever he wants to do. As circumstances change, he will make up with his worst enemy or part company with his closest ally.
See, and this is more of that sociopathic behavior. There's no romantic loyalty. There's no sentimental loyalty to people. There's no sense of honor. It's all about practicality. It's all about pragmatism. It's all very mechanical. Obviously not in terms of actually building something mechanical, but in terms of just viewing people as numbers in a spreadsheet. So just when you try to reduce it down to IQ, you're not getting a full picture of the differences in intellect or just in the mind generally. It's just the one tiny thing, one little tiny aspect that we can measure, and it leaves out all these very important distinctions.
Hence his wonderful adaptability. Flexible and rational, the Jewish mind cannot be bound by conventions. The goodwill of a Southern gentleman takes set forms such as courtesy and attentions, while a kindly Jew is ready with any form of help that may be needed. So the South looked askance at the Jews as no gentlemen. Nor have the Irish with their strong personal loyalty or hostility like the Jews. On the other hand, the Yankees have for the Jews a cousinly feeling. Puritanism was a kind of Hebraism and throve most in the parts of England where, centuries before, the Jews had been thickest. With his rationalism, his shrewdness, his inquisitiveness and acquisitiveness, the Yankee can meet the Jew. Like all races, it's...
I don't know why that part cut off. But what he said is also something to think about. That one of the reasons why Jews have been accepted into these societies is the Puritans, the Protestants that founded this country, were kind of Judaic. They did view, and still many of them do, this is the evangelicals today, still view Jews as spiritual brothers or at the very least cousins. And so there is an acceptance of Jews that goes beyond what they've probably experienced in other places they've made, that they've decided to make their home. By the way, another fucking cricket just moved in here apparently. So I swear to God, it's not my smoke alarm if you hear anything. It's a particularly loud one. It must be pretty close. I'll have to kill it after the show.
Like all races that survive the sepsis of civilization, the Hebrews show great tenacity of purpose. Their constancy has worn out their persecutors and won them the epithet of stiff-necked. In their religious ideas, our Jewish immigrants are so stubborn that the Protestant churches despair of making proselytes among them. The skyrocket careers leading from the peddler's pack to the banker's desk or the professor's chair testify to rare singleness of purpose. Whatever his goal, money, scholarship, or recognition, the true Israelite never loses sight of it, cannot be distracted, presses steadily on, and in the end, masters circumstance instead of being dominated by it. As strikers, the Jewish wage earners will starve rather than yield. The Jewish reader in the library sticks indomitably to the course of reading he has entered on. No other policyholder is so reliable as the Jew in keeping up his premiums. The Jewish canvasser, bill collector, insurance solicitor, or commercial traveler takes no rebuff, returns brazenly again and again, and will risk being kicked downstairs rather than lose his man. During the Civil War, General Grant wrote to the War Department regarding the Jewish cotton traders who pressed into the South with the Northern armies. I have instructed the commanding officer to refuse all permits to Jews to come south, and I have frequently had them expelled from the department, but they come in with their carpet sacks in spite of all that can be done to prevent it. Charity agents say that although their Hebrew cases are few, they cost them more than other cases in the end, because of the unblushing persistence of the applicant. Some chiefs of police will not tolerate the Hebrew prostitute in their city because they find it impossible to subject her to any regulations. In New York, the line is drawn against the Jews in hotels, resorts, clubs, and private schools. And constantly this line hardens and extends. They cry bigotry, but bigotry has little and nothing to do with it. What is disliked in the Jews is not their religion, but certain ways and manners. Moreover, the Gentile resents being obliged to engage in a humiliating and undignified scramble in order to keep his trade or his clients against the Jewish invader. The line is not yet rigid, for the genial editor of Vorwärts, Mr. Abram Kahan, tells me that he and his literary brethren from the Pale have never encountered anti-Semitism in the Americans they meet. Not the socialist Jews, but the vulgar upstart parvenus, made to feel the discrimination. This cruel prejudice, for all lump condemnations are cruel, is no importation, no hangover from the past. It appears to spring out of contemporary experience and is invading circle after circle of broad-minded. People who give their lives to befriending immigrants shake their heads over the Galician Hebrews. It is astonishing how much of the sympathy that 20 years ago went out to the fugitives from Russian massacres has turned sour.
So there you go. He outlines a lot of just the difference in behaviors, and that this quote-unquote anti-Semitism that Jews are always complaining about, again, this is over 100 fucking years ago. This is before the Holocaust. All this anti-Semitism that they're always bitching about, it's never a product of just some weird innate aspect of white people. It's born of the behaviors that the Jews or that they indulge in, and often at the expense of white people. And that white people eventually, as you said, like there's white people who they're bleeding heart liberals and they're, oh, we got to help these poor Jews that are suffering this oppression in Russia and welcome them in. And then after they have to deal with them for a while, they're like, fuck, what the hell, man? No wonder they got kicked out of Russia. And this goes all the way back to the Civil War. You mentioned, we've gone over that, the Civil War where the Jewish peddlers were banned from from selling their black market wares by, I forget, he mentioned who it was. I forget who it was that did that. But it's because of their lack of ethics. It's their lack of ethics, their single-mindedness, their focus, their laser beam focus on profit. Their minds that lack the sentimental, that lack the whimsy in the European spirit. This kind of sociopathic way of viewing, people as objects.
Through fear of retaliation, little criticism gets into print. In the open, the Philo-Semites have it all their way. The situation is honey above, gall beneath. If the Tsar, by keeping up the pressure which has already rid him of 2 million undesired subjects, should succeed in driving the bulk of his 6 million Jews to the United States, we shall see the rise of a Jewish question here, perhaps riots and anti-Jewish legislation. No doubt 30 or 40,000 Hebrews from Eastern Europe might be absorbed by this country each year without any marked growth of race prejudice. But when they come in 2 or 3 or even 4 times as fast, the lump outgrows the leaven, and there will be trouble.
Well, two things. One, if you notice, he said 6 million Jews. The reason he says 6 million Jews is Jews have been saying 6 million Jews forever, no matter what the thing is, because it's got a religious significance. And so when it's the Holocaust, it's 6 million Jews. When it's the pogroms, it's 6 million Jews. You can go throughout history. Jews are always complaining about 6 million Jews. In fact, there's that video, I don't have it on my computer right away, but where they've talked about the Holocaust of 6 million Jews, and this being like a headline in newspapers going back, a couple hundred years, where Jews are always complaining about 6 million Jews being attacked somewhere. So it just, for whatever reason, Jews have always said 6 million Jews, no matter what the persecution narrative is. It's always 6 million Jews. So that's the first thing that he mentions, that the 6 million Jews. The problem is, again, he believes in the possibility of assimilation. So his issue isn't so much that there's Jews coming to America. He believes that they will be absorbed and they will assimilate. And so his issue is more the rate at which they are coming. He thinks they're coming here too fast, and that's going to alter forever the character of the United States. Well, they didn't have to come here faster than they did, because they have altered the character forever of the United States. And the other issue, too, is the way that he phrases this, the way that he talks about this in terms of, if they keep coming here and they keep changing things, it's going to lead to anti-Jewish legislation. That's also a major miscalculation. That's a major underestimation of his. I don't even see, again, this doesn't even seem oppositional to me. So I was going to say his opponent, but I don't even feel like this is all that oppositional. As I said in the beginning, he's very even-handed about all this. He doesn't seem to be, just because he's describing some really bad characteristics of Jews, he doesn't seem to view them oppositionally. And he seems to very much underestimate the influence and successes they will have in the future if he thinks that there's going to be anti-Jewish legislation or any kind of, here we are 100 years later and Jews fucking run the country. If there's anti-Semitism legislation now, that's how wrong he was. His expectation was that white people would have enough and legislate some sort of action or regulations that would help curb the influence of Jews. We are deporting people who are criticizing Israel now. So this is what I mean by don't underestimate Jews, because clearly whites underestimated Jews.
America is probably the strongest solvent Jewish separatism has ever encountered.
So this is why he underestimated Jews, by the way. I think he underestimated Jews because he overestimated America. Because the argument he's going to make now is that, sure, Jews have all these issues, but America is so uniquely awesome. And by the way, this is a very boomer view of the world. This is the argument, or at least the mindset you'll encounter when arguing with boomers about immigration. They have this weird, naive patriotism that imagines it's basically magic dirt theory. They imagine that just because America is so wonderful that it can magically absorb anyone who comes into the borders and instantly make them American, strip them of all their biologically driven behaviors and their cultures that they bring with them when they come here, strip them of everything, wipe out their hard drive, reformat it, and reinstall America 2.0, and they'll be compatible with everything. And that's just not the case. And unfortunately, this is the way that a lot of these people thought. This is the way he thought.
It is not only that here the Jew finds himself a free man and a citizen. That has occurred before, without causing the Jew to merge into the general population. It is that here, more than anywhere else in the world, the future is expected to be in all respects better than the past. No civilized people ever so belittle the past in the face of the future as we do. This is why tradition withers and dies in our air. And the dogma that the Jews are a peculiar people and must shun intermarriage with the Gentiles is only a tradition.
See, and this because he's a progressive, he delights in the idea that America is rejecting tradition. And that there's a little bit of truth in what he's saying, not in the way that he's saying it, though. So he says that when Jews come here, that they will change their behavior because America is rejecting tradition. And that the reason why it rejects tradition is that it so much believes, it's very confident in its belief that the future is going to be better than the past. Remember, this is 1914 when he's writing this. This is before a couple world wars would probably alter that perception. But he's right in that that is usually when you have people shed tradition, when they start to think that the future is going to be better than the past. And I think that's why you have a return to tradition among white people today, is because no one thinks the future is going to be better than the past right now, or certainly not white people. White people are not excited about the future right now. And so that's why they're embracing tradition. And I think that that's also why they're not so confident that people like Jews or other immigrants are going to be a benefit. I think in order to maintain the mindset that allows for mass immigration to go unnoticed, even if it's not asked for, there won't be a sufficient pushback from the native population to stop it if the native population is convinced that the future is going to be better than the past. The second that the native population begins to believe that actually the past is better than what the future is going to be like, I think that's when you have and I think that's what we're seeing. That's when you have a rejection of immigrants of all types, whether it's Jewish or non-Jewish or whoever it is, because now it's not like the argument that immigration is going to enhance your life. It's already kind of a hard sell, and when you already think that the future is going to be worse, than like if every day is worse than the day before, then why would you want to complicate things with immigration? So I think that he's right in that respect. That's not what he means, though. What he's meaning is that because Americans were so enamored with the idea that the future was always going to be brighter than the past, and that we were going straight to the moon, there was no stopping this train, that Jews would be swept up in this, that Jews would also reject their traditions. And that one of those traditions is he'll continue as when I unpause this here, but one of those traditions was only marrying other Jews. So in effect, he's their in-group preference, their nepotism, their racial segregation, this would also be discarded. And so it would accelerate their assimilation, or at least facilitate a type of assimilation. The Jews would stop being separate as a people, because they would, just like other European groups that came to America, they would breed with the founding stock Americans and the other European immigrants, and they would cease to even be Jews, because they would reject tradition, they would reject the past, and they would embrace this glorious American future that he was envisioning. And that's very naive, but that's also, I think, that's how boomers viewed immigration in the 1990s. When you had people that thought that the world was their oyster, America was number one. They're watching, as we're launching space shuttles. We got the Berlin Wall is coming down. We've got this is all pre 9/11, right? Where everything seemed like technology is getting better. Computers are revolutionizing everything. The internet's been born. Everything's changing. It looks like the sky's the limit. America is at the forefront of all of this. And so allowing these immigrants to come along for the ride, it's not as scary of a proposition, because if your life is going to be better in the future, to the extent that boomers even thought about that, in terms of what that would mean for their children, that would alleviate any kind of stress that they might have about the impact that immigrants would have on the futures or the future of the country, because it's going to be better. So even if they're somehow making it worse, the net is still positive, right? That when you factor it all in, okay, maybe they're holding us back a little bit, but we have so much fucking momentum as this unstoppable force, this American, train that's on, that's flying down the tracks, that even if the weight of the immigrants on the roof of the train cars, it slows us down a little bit, it'll almost be imperceptible. Like, it won't be that big of a problem. It's not until the train is broken down and you're getting off the train and having to eat the food that's in the caboose that you notice all the Indians hanging out on the roof asking for handouts, that you're like, what, fuck these guys. I think that's what it is. I think that that unfortunately is what he was caught up in, this optimism that, America was just, there was nowhere to go but up. Like, it was everything, it was unstoppable. And having some Jews it was going to complicate things, but maybe if we could slow it down, it's not that big of a deal, and they'll eventually just be absorbed into the melting pot. The
Jewish dietary laws are rapidly going. In New York, only 1/4 of the 200,000 Jewish workmen keep their Sabbath, and only 1/5 of the Jews belong to the synagogue. The neglect of the synagogue is as marked as the falling away of non-Jews from the church. Mixed marriages, although by no means numerous in the centers, are on the increase. And in 1909, the Central Conference of Jewish Rabbis resolved that such marriages are contrary to the tradition of the Jewish religion and should therefore be discouraged by the American rabbinate. Certainly every mixed marriage is, as one rabbi puts it, a nail in the coffin of Judaism, and free mixing would in time end the Jews as a distinct ethnic strain. The hard-shell leaders are urging the Jews in America to cherish their distinctive traditions and to refrain from mingling their blood with Gentiles. But the liberal and radical leaders insist that in this new, ultra-modern environment, nothing is gained by holding the Jews within the wall of Orthodox Judaism. As a prominent Hebrew labor leader said to me, by blending with the American, the Jew will gain in physique, and this, with its attendant participation in normal labor, sports, athletics, outdoor life, and the like, will lessen the hypersensibility and the sensuality of the Jew, and make him less vain, unscrupulous, and pleasure-loving. It is too soon yet to foretell whether or not this vast and growing body of Jews from Eastern Europe is to melt and disappear in the American population, just as numbers of Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French Jews in our early days became blent with the rest of the people. In any case, the immigrant Jews are being assimilated outwardly. The long coat, side curls, beard, and fringes, the wandering Jew figure, the furtive manner, the stoop, the hunted look, and the martyr air disappear as if by magic after a brief taste of American life. It would seem as if the experience of Russia and America in assimilating the Jews is happily illustrated by the old story of the rivalry of the wind and the sun and trying to strip the traveler of his cloak.
And even though the AI voice didn't have a real natural ending to that, that is the end of his assessment there. So again, very naive at the end after making his observations. They're all very relatable today about Jewish behavior. He imagines a future where the future's so bright you got to wear shades, and it's going to deprive the Jew. Just as he's noticing that there is fewer and fewer of these Jews are looking like the Hasidic Jews that we see in New York. Although look, they still even exist. That because Jews will start looking more Western and they're kind of shedding some of their more arcane traditions, that this is going to somehow translate to their genetically driven behavior, which of course is insane. Which again, some of it was surprising. When I found that he was a eugenicist, I was kind of surprised that he had this view, this very environmental versus biological view of the Jewish behavior. I was very kind of shocked by that. But again, like I told you, this guy seemed like he was pretty even-handed. He certainly wasn't like a Madison Grant type. He was more of a, this is the kind of person that saw the Jewish immigration as an issue, but not one that couldn't be solved with assimilation, that he imagined would happen at an acceptable rate. So anyway, I think it's a great insight to have this firsthand view of the Jewish immigrants that came to America around the turn of the century, and how all of the behaviors that were observed are behaviors that we are observing even today. And that we have to understand that this kind of behavior will exist probably for centuries to come in these competitors called the Jews. And what that means for white people in terms of how we need to alter our behavior to the extent that we need to in order to counteract some of these things that are going to spell disaster for us if we don't. I think the biggest thing is, as I mentioned before, that we need to start looking ahead at long-term plans and focusing, I even think to some degree, on preparing our children. And I've mentioned this before, that there's a lot of people who have this, because of our romantic, sentimental spirits, we do have this view of like, oh, what'd be great is if I just raise some kids on a farm and we can get them milking cows and whatever. It's like, okay, that's wholesome and whatever, but is that preparing them to be the head of a dynasty when you're gone? Is that preparing them to be in positions where they can actually have enough influence and power in the future to help preserve whites as a group? Is that giving them the tools and the resources that they're going to need in order to be effective in an increasingly hostile environment? Or is that just making some dumb, sweet though he might be, country bumpkin boy that's going to be way in over his head as AI takes over and completely unable to compete in a increasingly purely technological world? This is something that I think a lot of people on the right need to calculate into their plans when it comes to raising the next generation. That you can't raise a bunch of really sweet boys and girls that are, they're very nice and they love their animals. And I'm not saying you strip that from them, but you can't make them. You're breeding prey animals at that point. You're just creating prey for these sociopaths if you don't give them the tools that they're going to need to be competitive and moreover to be victorious in the confrontations that they are more than likely going to be facing in years to come.